Hello and welcome to the 24th episode of the Powerless Podcast. In this episode, I talked to Jordan Uhl, who is a contributor for the Young Turks, is a journalist who has his own independent Substack, has written for outlets like Lever News and Jacobin as well, and is the co-host of the Insurgents podcast. We talk about Jordan's start into heavy and alternative music, where some of that might have intersected for politics and different things of that nature, and some of the bands that kind of inspired him in that vein, what got him into politics on a layman level, and then what eventually got him to do it as his career and his in both activism, journalism, commentary, all those different kinds of things. So it was really great to talk to Jordan. We talked about those things. We talked about some current events issues. We talked about some things where music and politics kind of intersect, whether it's policy or social issues and things of that nature. So it's just a really interesting chat. I really appreciate that Jordan took the time out of his busy schedule to do this with me, and I hope you guys really enjoy listening to it. Before we get into the episode, make sure that you check out the podcast on all social media, whether it's Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Facebook, all those different things. Follow at The Powerless Pod. You can also email me at thepowerlesspod@gmail.com if you want to be on the show. If you have constructive criticism for me, if you want to tell me I suck at this, that's completely okay. I'll totally read it and feel great about myself afterwards. So make sure to find me at all those different handles. Before we get into the episode, one last thing I'm going to plug, as I've been plugging for every episode the last couple of weeks, is the metal band Whole Heart out of Grand Rapids, Michigan. Their latest EP they put out in 2022, Dreams That Die With You. It was my number one EP of 2022. Absolutely fantastic band. Very original sounding, I think, with the songwriting, with the kind of layers that they throw into the music, the production value that they do in-house with their bass player Kai, who is their producer, mixer, master. Absolutely fantastic and really top tier for a band of this level. So I just really encourage you guys to check out the band. There will be a clip playing before we get into the conversation with Jordan coming up here. So again, check out the band Whole Heart, and I hope you guys enjoy the conversation with Jordan Uhl. All right, we're here for the Powerless Podcast. I'm talking to Jordan Uhl, who is a contributor for the Young Turks, has written as a journalist for different things like Lever News, has independent Substack, and also is a co-host of the show Insurgents. Sorry if I missed something. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Good. I appreciate you coming on because I followed both your work on the kind of political sphere, whether it's commentating on things on the Young Turks or your own podcast that I really, really enjoy. I think more people should be checking out, which is the Insurgents. But I also find it interesting because this podcast that I do, I talk both with musicians, people in bands, and I've talked to a couple of local activists on the ground, political commentator Mac, the good politic guy that's on YouTube. And I try to find these intersectionality things of both music and politics, and you're kind of like the first person I've been able to find that really is first and foremost a journalist, a political commentator, but like, you've got a Slayer emblem in the background. I see you interacting very much in the alternative scene, which I don't see any other independent media figures really doing. It's clearly another whole aspect of what you're interested in that I'm sure probably has at some point in your life spoken to your political beliefs. I could be wrong. They could be separate things, but I just wanted to talk to you today, if it'd be cool, about your journey into what got you into alternative and heavy music, which maybe some of your, people that follow you politically might not know as much about. Also your political journey, and if there's anything there that kind of intersects. And we could also talk about a few things in the music scene, if you're open to it, that would kind of blend those two things together. But I guess to start off, after my little rambling there, what first got you into kind of the heavy alternative music, outside of the pop music sphere, mainstream music sphere? What kind of got you into heavy and alternative music growing up or later on in life?
So growing up, I think most people, I would probably guess our age. I'm on the cusp of 36. I mean, downloading was a big thing. I was like a teenager when Napster became a thing, and then obviously the other torrenting and downloading platforms that let you just rip albums. And look, I've come to take a different stance now and a different view on downloading and ripping music than I had as a kid. But and ironically enough, it was a friend had downloaded and burned Ride the Lightning for me when I was young.
Yeah.
And it was unlike anything I had ever heard or listened to at that point. I must have been 11 or 12. And from then on, I was just obsessed and loved. I still love Metallica, but I grew to really love and appreciate metal, and then grew into like hardcore and punk, and just that was like the formative moment for me. As it relates to politics, another friend burned me Toxicity in 2001 or 2, whenever that came out.
Yeah.
And think about where we were politically and socially then. This was, when I was listening to it, it was immediate aftermath of 9/11, the war on terror, and patriotism and nationalism was really high. And so much so that dissent was just taboo. Anyone who dared criticize the Bush administration, the war on terror, anything we were doing, especially on the foreign policy front, but that applied domestically and to domestic policy as well. And you saw that in what little pushback there was to the Patriot Act. That was such a subversive album in that moment where everybody had to rally around the flag. So that was another thing that just charted like a totally new course for me. Everyone remembers Chop Suey from that album, and that's like the hit. But like, really go back and listen to it. Just Prison Song, like opening with Prison Song is ridiculous. As a teenager in the immediate post 9/11 era, that was a really formative album for me.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. System's an interesting band too, right? Because as time has gone on, people have learned that like there's very eclectic political views in that band, which is wild to me, right? That's a whole other offshoot, right? Finding somebody in a band that's like so, anti-imperialist, like being pro-Trump was quite a sensationalistic story for music media for quite a while there. But Toxicity, especially, like you listen to that record, you listen to, which I'm sure Rage Against the Machine. If I don't know whether or not you're a huge fan, but that was something that like changed my politics forever as a kid growing up in a conservative small town area. But thinking of those bands and like the Bush era, you talk about metal, you talk about did you say was it Injustice for All? Is that what you said? What was the record for Metallica that you said?
Ride the Lightning.
Ride the Lightning. Sorry. Yeah, you even look at lyrics from even Metallica, which a lot of people don't talk about as a political band, but there's so many different instances of their lyrics that like are pertaining to anything from just commenting on war to commenting on some political issues at the time, whatever else. Like they may not do that as much now, but all those different bands can really kind of open your eyes to a few different things, especially in the dawn of the Bush era and post 9/11 and everything else. Going forward from that for you, did you talk about Toxicity, you talk about Prison Song and different songs like that are timeless, unfortunately. Did that, stemming from there for you growing up, this would kind of go into your role as a commentator on politics and journalism and activism. You've done all those different things. What kind of drove you, and this can be separate from music, but what kind of drove you to kind of not just be interested in it, philosophically, at the dinner table with, your family, or having drinks with friends or whatever, like what got you more involved in the really like analytical approach to it, the critical approach to politics from kind of a professional level? Where did that kind of stem from for you?
Politics was always just interesting to me. My great uncle was a labor leader in the Rust Belt who ended up serving in Congress for a couple terms. And learning that in elementary school, I thought that was just the coolest thing. So that was all that like planted the bug in my head. No one else in my family had any political aspirations. And I certainly don't. I would never run for office, but I've just always been fascinated by just the mechanisms of power and policy. So I was interested in it and liked talking about it, but never thought it would be anything. And went to college, didn't want to go to college, but did begrudgingly. And a year or two in, 2 years in, the financial collapse happens. And everything sucks. I'm seeing, again, I'm in the Rust Belt. I'm seeing friends and family lose their homes, lose their jobs. Everyone's struggling. And the Rust Belt got hit hard. So as I'm watching all of this play out over a few months, then of course you, and I'm sure all your listeners remember, all of these bank CEOs who got enormously wealthy off of ridiculously unscrupulous business practices like predatory lending, just knowing these people couldn't afford the loans that they were given or these mortgages that they were given. All of these, sophisticated financial instruments, which were just ways that they could just make money off of nothing. And decades of deregulation that they benefited from. They, as the people who created this problem that everyone else had to bear the brunt of, they got bailed out. Their banks got bailed out. They received bonuses with all of this TARP money. And homeowners, working people got nothing. Unfortunately, that was weaponized by the right, and that helped fuel the Tea Party, but that created just a fire and a burning passion inside of me to, I changed my major to political science. I was like furious. I changed my major and I was just like all in. Like I was so fascinated by how we're not allowed to swear on here, I don't think.
Yeah, you are. You are. Go for it.
Okay. I mean, I was just, I couldn't believe how they were fucking people over so brazenly. And there was zero accountability for a global financial catastrophe. So that was what just completely changed the course of my life and ultimately my career. And that also informed, how I look at politics, power, elections, candidates. What are they doing that will help improve people's material conditions? Because everyone then, and certainly still, pointed fingers blaming the other side. Most of the people, especially the power players, the leaders of these parties, the party line people, we're all taking money and taking donations from these banks or their lobbyists and meeting with them and all agreeing to various forms of deregulation or various forms of legislation that made it easier for that to happen, and then worked collectively to chip away at Dodd-Frank, which was the response bill to prevent this from ever happening again. I mean, that was just like essentially toothless by the time it passed. So
right.
That really was like the one point in my life that changed my career, changed my political outlook, and changed how I see politics and power in general.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. And I think a good point to point out from what you're talking about that I think I really resonated from the work. So I found your like kind of, you through political commentary a bit through actually through music first, right? Through seeing you like post, I think I saw you post a video of like Stray from the Path or Counterparts or something of that nature several years ago, and I clicked on your profile, and then I found all these different articles, found these different things that like, oh, this is also somebody that not only is into heavy music but is into the kind of things that I'm really interested in. And to go from that with what you're talking about in relation to music, I think some of the bands you mentioned earlier, or some of the ones that like I'm sure you're sort of friends with now in the more contemporary alternative heavy music sphere, like one thing that I really enjoyed from your work, not to say that you wouldn't, you wouldn't support certain Democratic politicians that are for certain things, or you wouldn't, push for a grassroots progressive movement for a candidacy of a candidate in Congress, or running for president or whatever else, but that you really did look at the issues first and foremost. And you, like, when I've listened to your podcast, the Insurgents, or when I've read your articles, it's very clear that you're talking not just about, I think it's very easy for a lot of resistance liberals, Democratic politicians, and even some independent media people anymore to really like look at how crazy reactionary right wing stuff is. But when you pull from where you came from, the financial crisis, which in a lot of ways was bastardized by the establishment Democratic part, at least the Democratic president at the time, right? Or, these various issues that have come about, that you talk first and foremost about the issues, and you don't make it this partisan grivel. And I think like part of that you can really find in some of the heavier music that you reference as an influence, or some of the ones that are more modern in the metalcore or post-hardcore or whatever sphere, is that it's first and foremost about the issues and understanding that it's a system that, to varying degrees, there are people there that could be meaning well in those institutions, but that like, there's plenty of people on the quote unquote electorate left that are also very much causing these problems, because they're still in bed with corrupted money and corrupted, super PACs, corrupted institutions in a lot of that regard. And I wonder, like, does some of that come from just, seeing the side of money in like the in the like establishment Democratic sphere, has that helped you both through just kind of what you've seen growing up in political science and growing up with music and different things like that kind of really challenge establishment narratives? What did have you? I guess I'm kind of blumbering this question a little bit, but like,
Okay.
have you noticed a bit like what is it for you that you think drives politics in that way the most, in your work as a commentator or journalist, that like shows that either whether it's a Democratic politician or Republican politician, that like the working people, like you said, growing up in the Rust Belt, like the working people really feel hosed. Where do you see, like, I guess the biggest problems for that? Where do you see them coming from? Does that make sense? Like,
Sure. Yeah.
Sorry.
I mean, you touched on it, right? It's as simple as it is. It starts with, but it's not only, money in politics. I mean, that is a factor in so many different political issues, and I think people of all political stripes recognize it, and that's maddening to me, because as you also said in your question, part of this financial collapse, and that was also before Obama. I mean, the repeal of Glass-Steagall, which allowed investment
100%.
banks and consumer banks to merge, that was what really created that problem. So it's not just Republicans and it's not just Democrats, and the party loyalty. When these people, so many, I would say a majority of people, think that politicians are corrupt, that the system is broken, these people are being, bought and paid for by lobbyists and special interests, they can articulate that, they can recognize it, they can get frustrated by it. But then when it comes time to vote, especially in the primary where it really matters, they just forget it. And they just go with who either the incumbent is, who has the most name recognition. They don't do that legwork of reading up on what these people's stances are. And then if they are elected, and let's say they ran as a progressive, we've seen this happen obviously with a few different people lately that are really causing problems, but like they run as somebody who kind of pays lip service to progressive ideas and then just becomes just total sellouts. They don't then support a primary challenger to get them out to get somebody in there who would tackle a problem like money in politics. And very frustratingly, the Democratic Party, and especially congressional Democratic leadership, will always support the incumbent no matter what. And that results in scenarios where, you know, the Coke industries and the Coke world, the one of the two brothers, one of them died, but you know, the surviving brother is gleefully supporting Henry Cuellar on the Texas border, who is ultimately just a Republican who ran as a Democrat to win that seat. I think it's Texas 28 or 27th. I can't remember which district. Against Jessica Cisneros, a young progressive woman who's not taking PAC money, who is running on an amazing set of planks in her platform. I mean, you had the top three Democrats in the House all campaign for, in some cases, flew down to that district to campaign for him over her. And this is the same. He's anti-choice. This came in the aftermath of Dobbs.
Right.
He is, you know, he's got like an A. He had an A rating from the NRA. He is like anti-immigration. Just his platform looks like, and especially his actions in Congress look like a Republican. The first 2 years of the Trump administration, he was a 70%. He had a 70% Trump score, like voting with Trump's position 70% of the time. Come on, this is like the height of the resistance era. And this is the guy that you support. If Trump was such a grave threat to America and democracy and all of our ideals, wouldn't you want this guy out theoretically, right? And that's the problem with party politics. That, as it relates to money, that manifests in primaries. There's this cognitive dissonance. People just, like I said, they can articulate the problem, they can recognize it, and no one wants to do anything about it. It's very, very frustrating.
You know, I just finished listening through your most recent podcast you did for the Insurgents with David Sirota, where you talked about even like, you know, not to make you talk about the same thing twice in a week, but you know, you talked about a little bit, you guys all talked about what Obama had said recently about like the you know, the passive language he used and like how wealth had been like accumulated to a whole bunch of people. Like he had no say in that when that all like really started snowballing in the 2008 financial crisis and everything else. Right. And that's, you know, that's the liberal champion, right? Like that's the guy that like you still look at polls, people in the, what you would call like just like normie Democrat sphere still view him. You know, it's come down, I think, a little bit, but I don't think very much. Still view him as like the end all be all of like liberal royalty, right? And that's the guy that like, you know, I loved what David Sirota said on your podcast. It wasn't even like he was just sitting there and letting it happen. Like, dude, you forced this. Like it was incredible to hear, you know? And so that's where I think it's frustrating for people that both want, you know, like you mentioned Cisneros in Texas, like you want people to go through the electoral process. You want people to be able to get elected with not only things that are progressive, but most progressive policies, when it comes to economics, at least, are also like what's popular with regular people across political spectrum, right? So like, it's so frustrating when you realize like the people in power that are supposedly the resistance party to reactionary right wing shit is you know, they're first and foremost sold to enterprise and to capital and not to everyday people, and yet they think they're owed the working class vote. You know, it's very frustrating to say the least.
Yeah, it's extremely frustrating because, I just don't know what people are expecting when, you know, they're working multiple jobs, when they're struggling to keep food on the table, to pay their rent, or in many, many, many cases, over half of their monthly income goes to rent, which is terrible. That's a situation that I've definitely been in. I know many people have been in. That should not be the norm. That should be a total anomaly. And when you have all of these things making it extremely difficult, if not impossible, for people to get ahead, what I'll never understand is when it comes time where you have your limited window to actually do something about it through the electoral process, which of course is not the only way to do something about it, but one of the big ways, you just forget that. And you go in and vote for whoever party leadership, your county party, your state party tells you to vote for. No, and that's what we do. We do on the Insurgents. That's what I try to do in all of my work, is just really focus on what they're actually saying and especially what they're doing. Because these people will tell you Biden's promises in 2020 in retrospect were hilarious. Part of it's he got dealt a shit hand with the Senate composition, and then has since lost control of the House. But a lot of big promises with no real fulfillment. And again, some of them are circumstantial, but some of them are just like, come on. And then in the primary, this is what made Obama's comments so frustrating. This was separate from what he said in that David Axelrod podcast. If you watched his documentary Working on Netflix, it's this hyped up thing as part of his huge, like multi-million-dollar deal with Netflix. It's just like a 4 or 5 part documentary series on Netflix where he talks to workers. And then just as the series goes on, it advances up the ranks. It starts with a couple service workers, and then it goes up to like a managerial thing, and then, or like associate, then manager, and then the CEOs at the end. Whew. In one of the episodes, he's talking about wealth inequality. And he starts off his episode talking about how, the top 1% control whatever the stat is, majority of the wealth. And he's like, oh, but then also there's this 9% that are extremely comfortable as well. We need to talk about that. Look, man, if you were going to make this your post-White House brand, like, at least have the decency to like pretend like you care beyond just an aesthetic consumption, like politics as consumption product. That's really, really frustrating. And it's really prevalent in the Democratic world, although it's catching on the right with their culture war boycotts. But the Democrats have really mastered how to trick people into thinking they're doing something about the problem through watching something, through buying something, through attending like a show or a movie, or listening to something with no real substantive action backing it up. And you see that in people talking about and framing. Now the right has since weaponized it, but for a while it was like the casting in movies were these huge advancements in our social system. And that was just always so funny to me as somebody who is pretty picky about what movies I even watch to begin with. But the idea that the Marvel Cinematic Universe was somehow advancing social or civil rights in this country is just laughable, because they don't care. Like they'll just it's all writer's room stuff.
I remember seeing, to your point on that specific thing, like I remember seeing like the, because I was like a fan of those MCU movies up until like the Endgame movie came out, and then like watched a few shows and was like, this is garbage, whatever I've done. But like I remember like the Falcon and the Winter Soldier one that they did, like they made an entire villain like what basically was, in their mind at least, or at least in a lot of right-wing people's minds, like Antifa. Like and then at the end of it, they're even having the main character say like, I like what you're fighting for, but not the way you fight it. You should do it this and this way. And it was like, this is like, or even like the Black Panther movie that got really big. Like the entire idea was like, well, you shouldn't fight against like certain like entire systemic issues. You should just like make sure you're treating each other nicely and all these different things. Or like talking, as a, like, I don't know, it's just like, yeah, to speak to your point, like without me rambling more about those things, like it like turning it to the whole crux of like major media made by, say, Disney or something, that is like the focal point of what is going to advance people when it comes to marginalized groups, when it comes to wealth inequality, when it comes to anything that people seemingly care about. And then you're going to just be the most vapid, like do the most vapid surface level thing. And one, like, doesn't help anything. And yet at the same time, right-wing reactionary people do think it's like the end of the world and totally come down on it as if it's indoctrinating children or people with like what they call cultural Marxist ideology or something, right? And so like it's a lose-lose situation where like nothing substantial is happening from that people think is important. And also it's totally like you're having this insane group of people just like get totally galvanized to be more and more upset to the point of like what you were kind of alluding to, which is like things like Target or whatever else that are so silly to get upset about in any facet, but like that's become where major political discussion is at, right? Like it's just so weird. It's hard to even explain to people in like a one-on-one conversation effectively, right?
Yeah, it's the way those are framed, all of that. It's not just MCU. It's a bunch of different things. It's corporations making their profile pictures like rainbow flagged or participating in pride events, while behind the scenes donating to anti-LGBTQI plus politicians. Like that has a bigger consequence than a few of their staffers riding in a float one Saturday. Right. And it's this kind of smoke and mirrors act that what we talked about with Sirota, Obama has gotten really good at. It goes back to his time in the White House. They really branded him successfully as like the cool, like pop culture president. The best analogy was like the fascination, like the social fascination with the Kennedys. And they really did that well. And he was cool. Michelle Obama was appearing on like nighttime talk shows, like they were in BuzzFeed videos, like they're very hip and plugged in socially. Biden does not have that kind of. They've tried, but it doesn't work with him. I
don't think he'd be able to. Yeah,
no, but they were really successful at that, and then that's parlayed into multiple book deals, speaking tours, all Netflix deals. Like they're doing fine. And what was frustrating about, and this is Sirota's observation specifically, that language, the wealth concentrated. He has repeatedly talked about, not just here, but not just on this issue too. He has talked about issues that he could have done something about directly, especially when he had a supermajority his first 2 years, and he chose not to. A year or two ago at COP27, like one of the climate summits, he talked about how young people are too cynical and they need to stop being cynical and fight against climate change. COP27, or the COP series of events, has deep ties and deep involvement from the oil industry. It's largely just kind of like a PR thing. There's no real material commitments that actually affect climate change that are made there. It's getting worse. Oil lobbyists are now vying for leadership positions at these events. But he also increased drilling and bragged about it when he was president. Like I can't remember what the setup was, but I don't know if you or your listeners remember that was me people. Like like asking for thank yous from a crowd about increased drilling and oil production. And then has the gall to then go to this event and say, like, we need to stop being cynical. It's these types of things on this wealth inequality, the wealth concentrated. Like it just happened while he was asleep. No, he allowed this to happen. And someone who has made that the focus of their political career over the past decade, Sanders, in the 2020 primary, as things were tightening up, we're going into Super Tuesday, Obama, who had sat out the entire campaign, it's reported he was calling around on behalf of Biden to get Buttigieg, Klobuchar, and I believe Beto to all drop out, back Biden, and they all appeared with him at his event in Texas because they knew Bernie had a really good shot in Texas, which would have changed some of the landscape. I'm not saying he would have won, but you see, hey man, if this is something you care about, which clearly it's not, Why did you kneecap the guy who's been speaking to this issue specifically for 10 years and the other guy's saying it's not a problem?
Yeah, and I think that kind of goes to where a lot of people become understandably disenfranchised with the Democratic Party, and hopefully in that instance, go to more like independent ideas, or like, you would hope unfortunately it doesn't go this way, but you would think when that happens, you'd hope that people could go to like local organizing or single issue advocacy or things of that nature. But unfortunately, when we see things like what's happened with Obama, or indeed Obama, when it comes to, like you said, Klobuchar, Buttigieg, all the other ones that like dropped out basically to all convalesce behind Biden to make sure a progressive candidate could never see the light of day against a Republican in the presidency run. It's amazing to me, I guess, that like these people don't realize that what they're doing is making it harder for their own party to survive, in a sense of like less and less young people, or, you're 36, I'm 31, right? Like we're in the relatively same like age category. Like people from our age group, or certainly younger, are getting to the point that like, we have access to all the information. You can no longer bullshit us anymore that you're working for us. So, it's, but what sucks about that is not that people realize that that's a great thing, but that like, that people see that, and a lot of times they go down this path of ending up in a place of supporting, we've just seen the data, right? Like we've seen a lot of independent people end up supporting like right-wing reactionary people just because they've seen how much corporate nonsense is so openly connected to the Democratic Party. Now it's in the Republican Party, but they just like, they can just point fingers, right? But it's maddening to hear something like that from Obama, who like, like I said, you're a few years older than me, but even for me, like that was a radicalizing aspect of politics in my life, was just like seeing what he said and then seeing 90% drone strikes, seeing what he said, and then like the wealth concentration with these banks and everything else. Like, it's like you don't want to say that it's entirely at the fault of these liberal politicians that far right extremism is on the rise that it is, but they're certainly not helping, and they're certainly not helping make a solid defense for it.
Yeah, it on the access to information point that you mentioned, 15, 20 years ago, they could really do whatever they wanted because most people's political information came from print. Very few people read, as we see, because it
doesn't happen.
It collapsed after classified ads left. And then, cable news or nighttime news, which never does a good job of really covering policies, political intricacies, that kind of stuff. Now you've got not just social media where anybody can share this kind of stuff, but, digital publications that do really, really deep dives, like Politico, The Hill, Roll Call, all these different like hyper specific outlets that do really deep dives into the day-to-day in Congress that you would never really get elsewhere. On top of that, you have a ton of independent outlets that do money and politics reporting or investigative reporting from different political viewpoints. That you didn't have that before. So the Democrats have gotten really good at being performative in their allyship and their support for things. But then knowing that even still, most people don't do that kind of research, don't really look up what is in a bill or what they're actually doing or what they're ultimately voting for. They see the aesthetic and they see the performance and they think, oh, okay, this person cares about XYZ issue, when it's much more complicated than that. And beyond just getting involved in a primary and really looking up what people stand for in a primary, you also need to look up, like, it's boring, but that's, a requirement of civic engagement. It's looking up what these things are, and not just at the federal level, especially at the local level, because people definitely don't give a shit there. And that allows businesses and special interest groups to just do whatever they want. In that same episode with Sirota, we talked about a town in Delaware that's trying to give LLCs the right to vote, and not just in referendums.
Fucking crazy.
On every single issue and every single election. Like, do you want a business owner to be able to vote for themselves and vote as their corporation, I mean, you're going to see a total shift in what that city's political makeup looks like and what they're allowed to do. That is, I don't think, a ludicrous assumption to think
No.
the outcome of that would be a net negative for workers.
Well, and talking about workers, like you're wearing what I assume is a local union hat that I see you wear, like, and everything, that you do with Young Turks and things like that when you're on video, but also, like, in general with workers' rights, like it's insane to me that people don't make those distinctions, or that, like, Democratic politicians, or a state like Delaware, or even the president who proposes to be the most pro-union president in the country's history, or whatever it is, right? Like that those things like, you don't see how that is completely eviscerating, like, help for the workers when it comes to local, on the as on the ground as it can be for politics, like, decisions. Because like you said in that conversation, I don't mean to keep referencing the episode you just did, right? But whatever, right? But, like, you guys made a good point that I think a lot of people need to hear, that might listen to this and are maybe more apolitical or something, that in that specific district, one, like, on a microcosm level, you're essentially adding, like, everybody to have, like the business owners to have double the vote in a place where it was already, like, to the point where it'd be 200 and odd some businesses able to vote, and there's like 400 and odd some people that typically vote in their elections. So and again, they would just have a monopoly on what they could decide to do in that area. And when you look at the precedent that can be set with that, in conjunction with, like, the complete evisceration, both locally, statewide, federally, with workers' rights in this country, it's like, you don't have to have a degree in political science. You don't have to be a journalist to see this as, like it's more dystopian than, like, movies. You know what I mean? Like, it's crazy to me, because people talk about in this, and I'm kind of jumbling around here, but to go to, like, the union rights aspect or worker rights aspect of it, aside from that voting issue, like, people have talked up the NLRB in this presidency. They've talked about, kind of indicting Starbucks at a certain point with what they were doing with anti-union practices. There's all these different stores that have unionized. There's a couple of different other industries and specific companies where people have been unionizing. But the problem, as much as it's great to see that some unionization is happening, and I absolutely love to see that, when it comes down to the Starbucks still isn't able to, they still haven't had to make a contract with a single union, right? Like, or they've been able to still crack down or shut down stores or whatever else. It's happened in a couple of other companies as well. Like, these things of talking about the Democratic Party as being pro-union, pro-worker, just because they're not as abysmally anti-union as the NLRB was under Trump or whatever else, like, it still just feels like theater, and the working class people are still just, like, like, feel like they don't have a single vote in anything, when there's certain areas where, like, a business owner might get two, right? Like, it's wild to think about the disparity in what's said and what's done. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, the NLRB is an interesting one, because that's one, and the actions out of the NLRB, you could tangibly say, okay, this is going to be better, maybe
Right.
just a little bit, but maybe a lot, if there is a Democrat in the White House appointing the chair or the head of the NLRB. Sure. So it's like it's things like that prevent me from completely withdrawing from federal politics, because you can change some things through the bureaucracy, which is great. The problem with Starbucks and Amazon and these big companies that have seen pushes for unionization, and very publicly their retaliation and their attempts to squash these unions, it shows the limits of the NLRB, specifically with how they punish or fine these companies. Because for a company the size of Amazon, or even a company the size of Starbucks, fines, various, warnings, whatever disciplinary action the NLRB has taken so far, ultimately will just become the cost of doing business, and ultimately the fee that you need to pay to union bust. Unless they make it so serious and so severe and hefty that it actually threatens their health as a business, they're not going to stop. And that's what's frustrating. And you see the limits of the regulatory state there. And you have these companies that you could argue are monopolies, or are too big that they are beyond reproach from the regulatory state. And that's a problem in itself. What are you doing then? The Democratic Party, certainly the Republican Party, but nobody really has a response to that. When you have these chains and you have these, in Amazon's case, behemoths that just touches so many different industries. When these companies and the CEOs and their C-suites are able to do whatever they want, and just whatever fine they receive ultimately just gets passed on to the consumer, that is extremely dangerous. That things are not going to get better. And then when they're allowed to continue engaging in union busting or unsafe workplace practices, and as they continue to grow, it threatens everybody. Because Amazon's getting to the point where it's like, it might be the biggest private employer in the country. I can't remember if it's past Walmart or not. Walmart, another example of a company that's tried to crush unions for years,
right,
but those are your two picks, right? And in many communities, especially small or rural communities, it might be the only decent job in town. So what do you want to do? Do you want to sit home and starve, or do you want to go work at this company where you could just get overheated, have no bathroom breaks, and die? Take your pick.
Well, that's the other thing that, again, just talking about the either apolitical or right wing, because I think sometimes in this vein, when you're talking about labor, oftentimes they can intersect, and that, somebody that doesn't know much about this goes well, why don't you just get a better job? Right? Why don't you in your community look for a better job if you don't like the job you have, right? And it's well, in several of these communities, and actually there's one for me not that far away that several companies, the companies in these distribution centers or in these manufacturing, not even manufacturing really, right? Distribution centers for various, whether it's Target or Walmart or Amazon or whatever else, that is the job that pays not terribly, right? In the sense of you might get paid $15, $16, $17 an hour starting off. And that sounds great to somebody that's 20 years old when, the fast food job pays shit or whatever, right? And yet, if you want to afford your own apartment, you can't even do it with those jobs, but you can try and you can struggle at the very least, right? And so the idea of just find something else, this sort of libertarian capitalist, the market will, coincide with workers and what's just available. It just makes no sense. It's not the reality of what you said, especially in the Rust Belt years past, the manufacturing jobs or whatever else, and now in so many places with distribution centers, it's there's no other job. Corporations have killed the small time job, so this is what we have. And when people kind of blow off these union efforts, or when Congress people, there's been some of them where even the most progressive Congress people have fumbled the bag in supporting these people when they really needed it. I understand where it makes people totally nihilistic, and you just you wish there was more there were more electoral figures, or at least more public figures that could really push for these things to be better for people, because people, regardless of political affiliation, workers are getting hosed. It doesn't matter who they vote for,
Yeah. It's tough. There's, again, a lot of factors at play. Until we have a multi-party system or even a third-party system, no one really is forced to do anything. Because so many people are just going to feel, okay, well, I'm voting for the lesser of two evils. Is that the best? Is that the best we want? No. Look how this works in Europe, most developed countries. There are other ways of doing it. We're just kind of tethered to this weird, antiquated way of doing it out of tradition and a misguided sense of nationalism and pride. And then the result is we have all these huge social ills and systemic issues, and we lag behind the rest of our developed, the rest of the developed countries on all these different things. And both parties know they don't have to do anything because what are you going to do? You vote for one or the other, or you don't vote. They're still going to be, that party is still going to have some control over what happens. They're going to be fine. Even if they're in the minority, they'll just fundraise and just do oppositional stuff for 2 or 4 years, and then they're back in power, and then they make excuses and blame the other party, and it's just whatever they are. They just switch the strategies based on their position in Congress. So they're not really required to do anything, and that's what's frustrating. I can't remember what else you had mentioned, but I don't know. I can't stress enough how people need to look beyond party affiliation. And that's something we try to do on our show, and I try to do in all of my work, is just really focus on the core components and issues that people are talking about or working on or whatever's in that story. Look past party affiliation, because I don't give a shit. Like I could not care less. And
in the magical scenario, right? In the magical scenario where a Republican did something good, you'd support it, right? Like that would be great, right? Like, or there's been very few instances where one of them, a far right person that I despise in a lot of things they say, has supported somebody in the Progressive Caucus on something that very rarely is just like common sense. Whether it's I think of like Sanders and Mike Lee when it comes to foreign policy, where like you couldn't talk about two people that would disagree on more, and yet they were both like, some of these different foreign policy measures we're doing with the military are terrible, right? Or I think AOC and I think it was Matt Gaetz were talking about like credit card percentages or something like that. Like I'm a little off of it, but like there are these instances where those people, if they would talk about that stuff, I'd be for them, right? Like I'm not like you said, it's not about partisanship, but at the same time, like it feels like you have zero partisan anything if you actually care about real issues. Like, to talk about some of the things you talked about in both on your Substack and when I think the article I'm alluding to would be what you did with Lever News. That would be in a little relation to music as well, was, when you were talking about Ticketmaster and Live Nation and the kind of convalescence of, some people would call it an oligopoly, some people would call it an essential monopoly, whatever the case may be, where you're kind of not only, these massive companies are not only hosing the people that are paying for the entertainment, the fans, the whoever else that are going to be coming to a concert, they're also hosing bands and artists that are getting next to no money in these regards, and like the convalescing of power, right? When it comes to like that kind of music aspect of things, or when we're just talking about the entertainment industry in general, one, like since the reporting you did on it, which was fantastic, I think you did it in November of 2022. Have you seen anything that's like to kind of see that that's going in the right direction? Have you seen anything that's showing that nothing's really happening with it, which I think unfortunately is what people would assume, or going in the wrong direction? Or have you seen any updates in that in general with live music and the kind of consolidation of capital there?
I've seen two things. One, hilariously like a nothing burger, and one inspiring. Let's start with the former. It was last week or the week before. It was announced that Ticketmaster, Live Nation, they're gonna, Biden, the big win for the Biden administration. They're going to list all of their fees up front, which is something that I thought they were already doing or required to do, but this is a new development, and mission accomplished. We did it. Promises made, promises kept. It doesn't change anything. All it does is change when you learn you're going to get screwed over by these absurd fees. Is it now or 30 seconds from now? That changes nothing materially, but it gives Biden a positive news story. They love it. Again, it's the aesthetic of change and politics as an aesthetic. On the inspiring front, and this is where I think things are really going to need to happen for one of the issues, merch cuts, to change. More artists are calling out venues about merch cuts, and if people are unfamiliar, that is when band comes to perform in your town, and the club says, "Okay, give us 20% or 30% of what you made on merch sales tonight." A lot of people don't know this happens. I didn't know it happened until I talked to people in the industry and was appalled. Hey, why do they get a cut of merch? Does the band get a cut of the bar? That's why people are there. Shouldn't they get a cut of the bar? That seems like a fair trade, right? No, they don't do it because they control the venues. They are the promoter. They control the ticket sales. What are you going to do? What are you going to do? You just give Live Nation the finger and then risk never being able to perform in a venue or have your tickets sold there or not have them as a promoter? That's a raw deal. You're risking your entire livelihood by taking a stand. But if everybody took a stand at the same time, what's Live Nation going to do? They can't reject all artists.
Right.
And that's the thing. Like, you see a lot of what's frustrating. What's frustrating to me is when people, and I understand the precarity, but I wish people would realize that if they acted in unison, or at least in a large enough cohort, Live Nation would not be able to do anything. But what's frustrating is when people are in a position where it would actually hurt Live Nation to lose them when they don't do anything about it. That's frustrating to me. If they're in a position where Live Nation and Ticketmaster want them to sell their tickets and do their tours through their platform, when it's more beneficial to, Live Nation, like Live Nation does not want to lose like a Taylor Swift, right?
Right.
Live Nation doesn't want to lose a Beyonce. When people of that size and stardom don't do anything on this front, that's maddening because you have nothing to lose.
That's the whole thing is like, I've seen, I've seen things, whether it's some big bands I'm into, or not big bands, but like bands in the alternative heavy scene that I've seen, whether it was, Counterparts, Straight from the Path, Silent Planet, insert whatever band you want to name from whatever record label here, right? Like, they're talking about in various areas with this, whether it's the United States, whether it's Europe, UK, whatever, like dealing with these merch cuts that like a band barely breaks even on the merch they sell half the time anyway, right? Like you're barely making any money from unless you're like the headlining band in a lot of these shows. I think a lot of people don't get that just because a band's touring internationally, touring across the states, doesn't mean that they're not struggling to just like make a decent income for 4, if they've got crew members, 6, 7 different people. And when, bigger artists won't use their pull, it's kind of like in everyday life with everything else that we've been talking about, right? Like if you're not willing to use your capital, like your political capital or your social will capital there, like to help artists, like it's just going to keep going that way. Because, I saw something from, I think it was like when one of the members of Straight from the Path that I follow on social media, that's very outspoken and has his own podcast.
Craig.
And things like that. Yeah, Craig. When he's talked about these things and people have said like, well, why don't you stand up to and just not do shows with Ticketmaster? And it's like, dude, have you seen what between Live Nation and Ticketmaster, what venues they run and what venues they own and what they control in all these different cities? Like, I'm from Illinois. Chicago is run by Live Nation and Ticketmaster. Like every venue, unless you're going to a DIY area where you might be playing in like somebody's barn or like a garage, which I love those shows, don't get me wrong. But like, I don't think that like, a national touring band that's opening for a bigger band, say, or a national touring band that's trying to play 200, 300 cap venues, they don't have that pull. And so then they have to deal with it. And then they walk away. Like I saw a video or a picture from one band that like venue through Ticketmaster and Live Nation didn't even allow them to use their own merch guy. And then you don't even know how those sales are going. And there's a line out the door because the person doesn't give a shit. And like you're losing money and you're still paying 15-20%. And, you know, it'd be one thing if we're talking about this in like conjunction with politics and like it was so niche to like the alternative scene that it was never really talked about in the congressional, you know, presidential political sphere. But like Joe Biden has talked about this specifically, like when it comes to Ticketmaster and Live Nation through social media and everything like that. And when it comes down to it, nothing's changed as far as like who controls what and like the total disparity with who's bringing the money in and who gets the money, you know? And to talk about like progressive politics, you can use that as a metaphor for so many different industries, right? Like it's not just the music industry that's feeling that. In some ways, one way or another, like workers and the people that are bringing things that are just getting hosed so badly with no help from even progressive politicians in a lot of instances, right?
Yeah, I think you could draw a parallel between what we just talked about and the political stuff, right? No one goes to concerts because they love Live Nation. I don't love the company. I don't even love the venues. Some are nice, but I'm not there because I like the aesthetic. I'm there because I want to see this band or this performer. And at some point, I hope that, you know, that Live Nation and Ticketmaster takes these people and these artists for granted, I hope will backfire. Because at some point, people are just going to get fed up. Bands are, whether it's some like sort of collective action or a competitor enters the market and offers venues and ticketing and all this kind of stuff with a more fair compensation structure, something like that to totally take out that company would be spectacular. Who knows? At some point, that expectation that working people or for the Democrats or, you know, black voters is another, we hear time and time again, every cycle, you can't just show up to black communities during an election year and then disappear after you get elected. But they still do it. At some point, the voting bloc in America that are, you know, liberal black voters, which is a lot, at some point they're going to have every right to get fed up and frustrated. And I don't know, working people, unions, all of these groups, all of these voting blocs that the Democrats have taken advantage of and exploited for years and paid lip service to issues that they care about, that gravy train is going to run out. So I would hope, because I think they're slightly better than the Republicans and they're certainly not ideal, I would hope that they start to center and listen to and actually act on these concerns. Otherwise, it could be a similar outcome that I hope Ticketmaster and Live Nation faces.
Right, absolutely. One last thing I wanted to ask you about in regards to kind of music and politics, and then we'll get to one last question I have for you before I let you go. Thanks for taking the time with me. I really appreciate it. Is, you know, I feel like, and you can tell me if I'm wrong here, but like since about 2016 or so in the music scene, especially the heavy music scene that I think you and I are probably both pretty dialed into, you know, I always felt that in the alternative music scene, there was like this inclusivity, like kind of like you just assumed that, you know, marginalized people, you know, people of all walks of life could be accompanied into like this alternative music scene, whether it was emo, post-hardcore, hardcore, metal, whatever, metal to a less extent, but like all these kind of alternative scenes were really there for people to feel included. You know, the politics of it were ideologically left wing in a lot of aspects, pretty outwardly in a lot of instances. And yet I've seen a lot of things, both from, you and I chatted about this through Instagram. I won't say the person's name, but like, because I don't want to give them any more publicity, but you know, a pretty prolific music podcaster, as an example, recently like brought on Blair White, who is like a trans, like basically anti-trans activist, anti like LGBTQIA plus community issues, very conservative, not just from that, but also on the ground from, I saw some things from some various people at like a Bane concert and all these different ones that like coming out and getting mad that these bands are politically left wing, politically inclusive of marginalized communities. And I just like, I don't know, it's kind of an open ended question, but like, have you felt like, and have you seen as a fan of this music, as a fan, like somebody that's, friends with bands in these communities as well, with kind of that knowledge on these things, have you noticed or have you seen sort of like this kind of resurgence of nihilism and reactionary people within a scene that otherwise is supposed to be at least supporting of marginalized communities?
Maybe a bit. A factor now is just that compared to 10, 20 years ago, everybody's views are broadcast versus we just kind of speculated or what we heard during like, between song crowd work type stuff. So not everyone wore their values on their sleeves. Some did, and we would see that and appreciate it. But I think now with everybody broadcasting what they think, you might be surprised that there's all these reactionaries. And I think COVID changed a lot of how, for some people, changed how they see the world and also how they see other people. And a lot of people are also being misled. It's on the specific case of, that person just admitted they've always been a conservative. So I guess with that context, it's not very surprising. But for people to go to a show in general, in this larger umbrella of genres and subgenres, to go to one of these shows and expect them to share your anti-trans views and your reactionary views certainly says more about that person than I think it does the scene at large. That person has just clearly created an echo chamber and a pattern of media and social media consumption that they are so saturated with anti-trans rhetoric that someone not sharing that hateful view is shocking or disappointing or whatever word she used to describe that Bane show. That says more about her than I think some sort of industry-wide trend.
I agree, and for the record, I feel the same way. Like I do feel like I've loved to see not just because online isn't everything, right? Like in a lot of ways, it's the cesspool of thought, right? But it's been great to be at some shows or see things from different bands or whatever. Now, like you said, everybody's views, everybody's values are kind of broadcasted more now, and to see when that's been happening, more and more of these bands just show that they're completely in the right mold, in the correct mold. I shouldn't say the right mold, right? They're in the correct mold of things, and but I don't know. It was like the reason why, and again, like it was the same thing. I was just you and I a couple weeks back were messaging back and forth. It was the person I was talking about earlier that runs a major like music podcast platform was it really kind of put a bad taste in my mouth of like some of what I guess like not the everyday people going to punk shows, going to hardcore shows, even people that might be centrist or right wing. If they're there, they're just there to enjoy people, and they wouldn't care if somebody said something that they disagreed with, right? Like it's just like you're there to be at a but like bringing up and talking about and I guess giving like the one voice from a marginalized group you give the voice to is somebody that is like clearly like there to be reactionary, like have regressive views for people, and you're talking about that on an otherwise apolitical music based so-called, even though he talks about a lot of business and stuff on it, spectrum. Like it just felt to me like it was like a really weird convalescence of like what's been going on in like the kind of influencer whatever entertainment people through YouTube, that like without even, maybe the guy didn't even mean that much by it, but like you end up, I think he did because he's a prick, but like the just I guess like the concept of just like bringing on somebody that otherwise has had like horrific views on things and acting like this was like a good avenue into like the music sphere. You know what I'm saying? Like I don't know. Like it was just like it was like a very weird. It was funny to see the response online, I guess, because there was people that were totally in line of like, well, you should listen to what everybody has to say, despite whatever they say about groups and values of like marginalized human beings and like their freedoms and all that kind of stuff. And then other people that are just blatantly pointing out that like if you wanted to talk to somebody from the community, why did you specifically pick this person other than to be showcasing regressive values? I guess, you know what I mean? Like, I don't know. It was like a good microcosm of like how just disjointed the music community can be on a lot of these issues, you know?
Yeah. I think for that person, that YouTuber, it was clearly about views. Maybe there was, the strategy was outrage.
Right?
Yeah, totally. I mean, it is definitely something I know they all consider. They like to defend themselves when they are on the receiving end of backlash, not just this person, but just the right in general, as being willing to engage in debate and free conversation and dialogue. And that is always them having somebody on who shares their views, just sitting talking to each other about how they hate XYZ group or XYZ type of person or thing or policy. And it's just, we're sitting here kind of commiserating about this policy or this marginalized group or social concept or construct that we hate, and that you think this is bad means that you can't have free conversation. That's not how debate works. And the thing is, I will go to my grave believing in my heart that nobody has ever had a good debate on YouTube. It is just
never. It's
there
impossible.
is no good debate on the internet. It is impossible to have a live stream or even YouTube debate, because that is not what they're doing. They are performing for their audience, so whoever gets their base and people who agree with them more riled up in a chat, which ultimately just helps the channel, increases views, increases engagement, shows the YouTube algorithm that this is something that we should promote to people. It is just performance, and it is so fucking vapid. I hate the entire concept.
There's a political commentator that sometimes I agree with, sometimes I don't agree with, more lately, Secular Talk, that like the guy talked about at one point that debate is the WWE of thought, right? Like that it's just about performance, and you can enjoy it, but to try to, that's fine. I don't enjoy it because it makes my blood boil. Like, but that like to walk away from that and think that like because one person owned the other, that means that like this went well or this was constructive. It's like, no, read reports, read journal articles, read the news, and make your own opinion, because half the time it's not about who's most knowledgeable. It's about who can dig the best, or who can be the most confident, or who can say the most like aggressive thing in an argument. Almost, it's ridiculous.
Yeah, we all lose. It's just that is seen, unfortunately, by so many young people as the way we talk through difficult concepts or ideas is so unhealthy. Because it's not structured. It's not, you don't have to stick to a specific motion or a very specific point. There was a group, and these would be broadcast on NPR and distributed as an NPR podcast. I think they still might, but definitely in the 2010s and 2000s when I was in college, I would listen to a lot of them. They were called Intelligence Squared. And you have two people on each side. And look, they're not as exciting as a YouTube or Twitch debate, but this was how I think a good debate in this era could be done. Here's a motion. These two people argue for it. These two people argue against it. And then there's a rebuttal. And then the audience is polled on this motion. Do you agree with this position as they enter the arena or forum or wherever it's being held? and then polled after the debate. And whoever moved more of the audience on this specific motion, quote, won. And then it's all, they go home, they're not screaming at each other. Because like, if that's how you behaved, you would lose. And I just think it's not as sexy, but if that's how these were done, they would be better off for everybody who watched.
Yeah, I think, and I think I also heard you mention this on something a while back, but like, I think the crux of it is people that want to actually really be informed on policy and issues and stuff is that government is boring. Like, like it's, you learn about very minute things that may or may not be changed. And occasionally there's some hot seated thing that CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, and a lot of the bigger independent media people might talk about, or nightly news, whatever crazy people like Newsmax. And they'll talk about that for a bit, but then it goes back to like culture war stuff or some sensational thing like what we saw recently with unfortunate tragedies of billionaires in the sea or whatever else. Like, and then like what's really going on day to day for progressive or aggressive policy gets lost in the weed of nothingness, right? Because it's not sensationalistic. It's not sometimes always overly interesting. But if you spent like 3 minutes a day, 5 minutes a day looking at that, and then like hearing where elected officials are at with that, or advocacy groups or whatever else, like there's a lot more to it. But but I do understand that like that's not where people go to. So instead you get to debates between like two people that spend all their time sitting on Twitch and or whatever else. And yeah. I'm not negating on that. Like that's people. I'm not hating on that, but I'm saying like that's not where you learn. That's where you go for like fast food politics.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, so again, thanks for going through that. The last thing I kind of wanted to ask you, I usually ask this to bands because I mostly talk to bands. I've talked to a few activists and journalists and commentators and things like that. But since you're a big music fan, I figured I'll still ask you this. If this is a fun one, this isn't politics based really, but if you could put together your dream band of like, so this is like Fantasy League, band edition, where you could take people living or dead of any walks of life of music, punk, hardcore, pop, classic rock, whatever, and put together a band. What members would you put into a band?
Oh my God. I wish I had a little
Half the people I ask this question absolutely hate it. I keep saying half, and then it seems like every single person I talk to, they all hate it. But I'm still going to do it, so whatever.
That's so tough. It's so tough, like on the spot too.
Well, that's the whole point, though, right? Like,
yeah. Okay, let's start with Joey Jordison as drummer. We'll start there.
Good. Yeah.
God damn. Trent Reznor is vocalist.
Okay, hell yeah.
David Davidson on guitar from Revocation.
Nice.
Tosin Abasi also on guitar.
Hell of a pick. God damn, yeah. Having Joey Jordison and Tosin Abasi in a band together already sounds completely insane.
Yeah. Bassist. I don't know. Bass on track, I guess.
Yeah. No. You listen to metalcore, right? It can be a computer. Computer is the bass player.
No. Neck from Stray.
Okay. Yeah. Great pick.
Yeah, that's my.
All right, so you said David Davidson, Joey Jordison, Tosin Abasi, Trent Reznor, Neck. Yeah, and that's a 5-piece, right? Yeah, I got it. Okay, yeah. That's a great pick. You said you said you had to think about it, but I mean, you got that pretty quick. That's a great lineup. That's like tech, new metal, hardcore. I don't know what the fuck you call that.
Industrial, technical.
Yeah, because I forgot Trent Reznor when I'm thinking of those genres. Yeah, what the hell? Yeah.
It's a mess. It sounds like chaos, but like beautiful chaos.
Yeah, I would love to hear that. Again, that's another. Some people do this, and like they'll give me a lineup, and I love each band member they give me, and I'm like, what the fuck are you gonna do with that? But but this one, I could see it. It'd be great. Again, Jordan, thanks so much for going over this stuff with me. I appreciate your time going over an hour with me on music and politics and stuff. Go ahead and plug where people can find your podcast, where people can find you, where people can find your work, and things of that nature.
Sure. You can find the Insurgents on all major platforms and at insurgentspod.com. And I'm on Twitter at Jordan Uhl.
All right. Thanks a lot for doing that. Again, if you ever feel inclined to come on here again, I would love to talk some more like music, political issues with you as they come up. If they come up, hopefully things get better, but you never know. Before I let you go, I know you're not, usually I do this with bands that, I have them plug their music at the end, but we've talked a little bit about music and how it integrates with politics. So, any song you can think of that was kind of a big influence for you that you'd want to play at the end of this? Anything that kind of comes to mind for music, to kind of end the podcast?
Oh, Bulls on Parade.
What's funny is I had Mac on, who is the other political commentator I had on. I don't know if you have seen him much, but I asked him the same thing. He picked the same exact song.
Okay,
so there's something about Rage. No. We're playing it. It just shows that, like, goddamn, Rage has some pull in the political sphere.
They're great. They're great.
So we'll leave it off with Bulls on Parade. Playing at the end of this. Check out Jordan Uhl. Again, a journalist, political commentator, host of the Insurgents pod. Thanks again for coming on, man. I really appreciate it.
Of course.